We live in a chaotic world, a world that changes daily, and where catastrophe seems to be getting worse from day to day. How to deal with that? How do we deal with that? Because we certainly do deal with that. We all are survivors. We're still here, roaming on this earth, having left behind millions and millions of our kind, in a past that we don't understand, moving towards a future that becomes more uncertain every day. Welcome to this video. In this video, we'll talk about the forces of the external environment and how our ego deals with them. In specific, we'll talk about the pain, or to put it better, the painfulness of the change that is required by the environments we exist in. Now, this is relevant because if you think about an ego that is manifested somehow within an environment that has a specific structure, and that structure is changing, then we must ask the question, how can we maintain anything that amounts to what we call an ego? That is, how can we maintain a stability within an environment that seems to be so unstable that no one can predict it? Before we get into this topic, let us assess the grounds on which we're speaking. That is, if you're new to this channel, I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here on this channel and the kind of general topics that we're going through. So first, we're mostly moving within the domain of Jungian psychoanalysis. That is, psychoanalysis in general, so the kind of perspective that there's an unconscious mind and that has some kind of influence on a conscious mind, and there are different compartments of the psyche and different compartments of the world that interact with it, is the sort of paradigm that we think within. Jung was a psychoanalyst. Carl is his first name. Carl Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, was a psychoanalyst who worked in Switzerland at the turn of the 20th century as a student of Freud. He was one of the first students of Freud and later differentiated or split from him when he proposed ideas that didn't really fit the theories of Freud himself. One of the core theories that Jung proposed that sort of went against the kind of grain of Freud's thought is the theory of the collective unconscious. Now, that theory won't really play a role in this video today, but if you're interested in theories on the collective unconscious and exploring that a lot further than Jung did, and probably a lot deeper than you've ever seen in other videos, then do check out the playlists that I have on the archetypes and the collective unconscious. By the way, if you're new to psychoanalysis and you're interested in getting a hand on psychoanalytic theories, I don't only recommend you to watch this channel, but I also recommend you to pick up some books and start reading along. Now, to do that, you probably need some kind of idea where to start and where to end. And I try to give you that idea in a reading list that I've created. If you want a copy of the reading list, it's totally free. Go check out a link in the description below this video, and you simply have to enter your name and your email address, and you can get the reading list in a day or two. But all right, let's get into this video. One of the core questions we have to ask first is, what does the ego want? That is, what is it that we consider to be an ego in the first place? And now we have to make a couple hypotheses here, and once again, since this is a relatively short video, or at least I'm aiming for it to be, we won't get through the whole thing. But if you're more interested in the ego, then go check out other videos I recorded on the ego that you can certainly find some on the channel. But the ego essentially is the core from which you move into the world. Now, that doesn't make the ego the objective core of the psyche. That is that which you really are. The ego for Jung is not what you really are. And the same, by the way, is true for Freud to a large extent. The ego instead is that kind of fictional core that mediates between what Freud called the pleasure principle and the reality principle. That is, for Freud, right, in the first instance, the ego mediates between the reality we encounter and the kind of drives that we have. So that is essentially the ego is that which allows you to exist as that creature full of bizarre drives and intentions, whatever that means, right? within a context that we call the environment that always limits or cuts into these drives, cuts into the pursuit of what you want, right? Now, we don't only speak on the Freudian perspective and not only on Jungian's perspective, but I take this a step further, looking at it from the perspective of experimental psychology and modern psychology. So what I would say is that the ego, in addition to this mediation between the reality principle and the pleasure principle, also achieves a kind of stability, a projection of something into the future that is actually not there, right? So I call this a fictional stability. The reason why I call it a fictional stability, again, is because the ego creates this core out of thin air in a way, right? It's certainly filled with or endowed with a vast expanse of content, but none of this content necessarily belongs to you. I say that this content is borrowed and you're therefore indebted to others because you borrow content that is actually not yours. Now, what the ego then becomes, if the content isn't its own, the ego becomes essentially a kind of reflexive mode by which you attempt to assemble content into a linearity. And basically what that means is I'm proposing that the ego functions as this sort of the filter between your sensory experience and your perception, right? So what is a percept? A percept is essentially that what you make out of the kind of sensory input that comes towards your sensory organs. So if you have input, right, photons hitting your retina kind of thing, then something has to be made out of that, and a lot of that is determined by the kinds of neuronal connections that you have in your brain. But those neuronal connections, again, only, first of all, they're assembled in a certain way, and secondly, they only determine part of the percept. Another part of the percept is matching that against previous perceptions. And this matching process, the kind of the mediation between this is what comes in and this is what comes out, is, at that point, I would hypothesize the ego to play an important role. Now, of course, the collective unconscious also plays an important role in structuring the kind of sensory input that we get. But I think, first of all, that happens after the ego structures the inflow. And second, we have to discuss this at another point in time. Again, to bring it back down, the focus of this video is to understand the ego and its interaction with the environment, and in particular to understand why the pain that we feel psychologically, let's say, but what else is pain anyways, is a consequence of the ego's resistance to the necessary and required adaptation it has to perform to the environment. So in order to understand why that problem is pressing, we then have to sort of shed some light on the ego in its constitution, in its interaction with the environment. And what I just told you, essentially, that the ego acts as this filter. Now, again, I want to make this clear. The ego is not the only filter, and there are many ways of defining the ego, but I think for the purpose of this discussion, it's a good interlude into a more complex picture of the ego. Now, what I'm saying here is basically that the ego attempts to encounter the world with certain assumptions, based on which it would then filter the sensory input that we receive from the environment all the time. This attempt is quite forceful. Now, you know this when you sometimes see something that you don't really know, but you kind of know it. So you're kind of familiar with it, but you're not really familiar with it. And you immediately interpret it as something you're familiar with. And then at a later point, let's say weeks later, months later, even years later, you will then realize, oh my God, wait, this was something entirely different, right? This was something that I did not anticipate whatsoever, but I still interpreted falsely for all this time. Now, one example for this is I used to think, like, a friend of mine had created a chatbot, and we had a group chat, and he told me that this chatbot would work, he gave the chatbot a name, and he told me this chatbot was an employee in his company. And for, I think, weeks and weeks on end, I thought this was actually an employee, and this person would sign emails, and they would chat in the group chat, and so on and so forth. And so they would the reason why he did this was to sort of make his team look bigger than it is, right? But the idea here was that this person was never real, but I thought it was real. And now maybe this is a bad example, but you know this probably from your everyday life, right? When you encounter something and you think it's true for a long time, and then you encounter it as something that is not true. Now, the most painful encounters with the truth are probably those encounters where you thought for a very long time that something very fundamental that you assumed was true, and then find out it's not true anymore. Like deceit is one thing. Deceit is that's really something to consider, right? If you, let's imagine you have a conversation, or imagine you wake up in the morning, you go make you coffee downstairs or wherever. For me, it's downstairs. And your wife joins, or your partner joins, or whatever. And little do you know that day is the day they're going to tell you that they've had an affair for the past decade. Right? Like you've been married for 30 years, let's say, and for the past decade they've had an affair. Now, that's gonna change everything for sure. And what that means, it's not only going to change the future, it's not only going to change your view of that person, but you're fundamentally going to question who you are. Like, how can I be so stupid to believe or have believed in the faithfulness of this person? I know people that have had this exact experience. Many people, professionally, and as clients and privately, personally, right? And that's something to come to terms with, because it doesn't only shatter the way you think of that person, but ultimately shatters the very fundamental assumptions that you have about the world and that your own cognitive structure is based on. Now, and in the context that we're speaking of today, I would say that ultimately that would be a moment in which reality re-emerges to encounter the ego. And the way I've framed it in other videos, and you can find those by searching for debt on my channel, but debt, like financial debt, is as debt, right? Like you have a certain debt that you owe to others because you don't own the kinds of assumptions you make. But for us, that's irrelevant today. Like what's relevant to us today is that the ego has assumptions that do not necessarily match the environment that it exists in. And I want us today to look at the ego under precisely that headline, the headline of assumptions. The ego, essentially, as I like to frame it, is a narrative, right? You tell yourself a story of yourself that you then somehow project into the future, be it that it's true or not, right? That's the kind of thing that we do all the time, right? We tell ourselves this story that we're healthy. We tell ourselves this story that our partner is faithful, that a dog is nice, that I will have a good career and I will have a stable income, that the economy of the country we live in is stable, and so on. We tell us those stories, macro and micro level, right, without actually having any control over them whatsoever. And based on these stories, we then go ahead and interpret the kinds of stimuli that we encounter. And there are bigger stories, the macro economy, and there are smaller stories. I will be healthy tomorrow, although that's quite a big story, but the kind of thing, I like eating apples, right? You like eating apples? Well, have you tried a rotten apple? You may not like eating apples after that. After a single encounter, if you like apples and you have the gut flu, the kind of, you know what I mean? A really bad food poisoning, essentially, and the consequential symptoms, and you somehow associate that with apples, it doesn't matter if it's caused by apples or not, you're not going to be able to eat apples for a long while. After a single encounter with that kind of stimuli that shatters your assumptions so fundamentally, right? And part of the reason why that works after one encounter is because food poisoning is a common source of death, at least historically or evolutionary. It has been a common source of death for millions of years for us, right? Because we didn't always have medicine or hygiene or anything like that, or beds, right? Or people to take care of us, right? Nature's cruel, right? You eat a bad apple in the wild and you die, you die, because you can't take diarrhea for days, because that's literally that's going to upset the kind of rhythm you've built for thousands of years in terms of finding drinking water with your pack, whatever. And so you fall out of the line, you're left behind. You'll at least lose some capacity to be at some kind of level in the dominance hierarchy of your tribe that will assure your safe continuance of living, right? Well, anyway, so the point is that the ego has fundamental assumptions about reality that somehow structure the way we perceive reality, the way, or the world, or the sensory kind of input that we encounter. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, the next thing we have to talk about then is the structure of the world. So what do we mean when we talk about the world out there and the kind of thing that the ego encounters, right? Like, what's that? What is that, right? And what is that especially in relation to the ego? And now I think one way to think about the world is essentially it's unknown, not one, right? But it's unknown in its potentiality, I would say. And the reason why it's unknown in its potential is because the ego is essentially structured in a way, or we are structured in a way, that we attempt to, again, mold the world, I would argue, in order to attempt to continue the narrative that we have built on the level of the ego. And the reason why I would argue that is because I fundamentally think, and again I argue this in more depth in other videos, I fundamentally think that the ego's self-perpetuating instinct is in an antagonism with the world's, sort of with two other things. On the one hand, with the world's constant force of change, and that's what we're exploring today. And on the other hand, with a third that is always attempting to bring those two to terms while integrating or by way of integrating what Jung called the archetypes, the sort of trajectories of the collective unconscious. And this third is, in my opinion, the self, right? And the third and the second, so the kind of the chaotic aspect, nature, and the self, they often come in the same shape. They often come together. They often come bundled in a bundle and move against the ego, essentially, I argue. But so there is an antagonism, right, fundamentally between the world and the ego, in that regard, in as far as the ego attempts to maintain its own integrity, its own internal stability, you may think, carrying that into the future. And the world does not necessarily comply to that. So the ego is always attempting to fit everything it encounters within the sort of categories that it has created, therefore viewing the world, again, as a potential, as a bunch of unmanifested potential, because it doesn't know the world, right? That it could use to build the kind of future that it wants to build, which is predicated on the self-perpetuating instinct. And that the typical example for that is earning money, right? Like, you need to earn money in order to perpetuate your ego, because your ego's fundamental assumptions are based on you having some money to some capacity, whether that's a lot of money or a little money doesn't really matter, right? It's more about the fact that you want to eat tomorrow. In order to do that, you need some kind of cash flow, right? So that's that. And so the consequence is that you see aspects of reality that will threaten your stability, your financial stability, as fundamentally threatening. So that kind of potential within the world is interpreted in a very particular manner, and then you see aspects of the world that are benevolent. Is that the positive way? Yeah, I think benevolent is the positive, right? Or whatever. So good for your attempt to pursue the maintenance of your financial stability as positive potential, right? So that may be a new job offer, or it may be simply a thumbs up from your boss, right? So and there's a lot that there's obviously there's a lot more complexity going on if you take the unconscious into account, because why do you think, like, why is there the fear of money or losing money? Why do you need your boss's thumbs up, right? So there are many levels of analysis involved here, right? Especially in the financial sphere, where you have, the whole organizational theory that also plays an important role. That is, I think, very well. Well, I think it's unintentionally using psychoanalytic or abusing psychoanalytic concepts in it to build its own frame, kind of thing. But so basically the world as potentiality, as potential, but that means basically that it's potential for good and bad. It's not only potential as in, when people talk about potential today, they're like, oh my God, yeah, there's so much potential in this and that. It's like, yeah, potential can mean something really good or something really bad. It could go north or south, kind of thing, right? And so the world fundamentally as potential for the ego, the kind of dwelling ground that the ego can be involved in. And now I want to make an important differentiation or important footnote. The world, as you would talk about it in other contexts, is the kind of artificial structure that the assemblage of multiple egos have created from what I would then call nature. And when I speak of the world in this video, at least in the last minutes, I don't mean that kind of world. I mean essentially reality or nature or the kind of unformed mass that is out there. The world in the sort of, I would say, sociological context or philosophical context, if you make up a good definition for it, would be something else. It would be considered the kind of, or already endowed with the artificial structures that we have created, right? It's the difference between kind of world and earth. What is the earth? The earth is the planet we live on. What is the world? The world is the kind of structures we have created on the earth, kind of thing, right? The kind of theater that we play within, right? Kind of, but even that the theater would be something else, even something altogether. But so the world or nature fundamentally, as opposed to the ego as potentiality. Now you then get fundamentally this dyad between the nature and the ego, right? Where the ego attempts to create this continuity, and nature essentially is this unformed mass of potentiality, which means it can go, again, good or bad. And then what that results in is essentially a tension, right? And this tension leads, on the side of the ego, leads to kind of closure. The ego kind of closes itself, right, in order to protect its own stability. And now here's the reason why. The reason why the ego is so protective is because the world is always in change. Potentiality means that technically everything could be the case at one moment and everything could be the case at the next moment. And that doesn't mean that the two everythings are the same. So the manifestation that I get at moment one doesn't have to be the manifestation that I get at moment two. So what that means essentially is that I cannot be sure that just because I probed, I took a sample at time point one, the sample results will be the same at time point two. Imagine a lake that you want to test the water quality of, and you take a sample at 2 p.m. and you then take a sample at 4 p.m. and they're entirely different, although everything else was the same. Imagine you could control all sort of your controllable variables. You can control, well, obviously you control them, but, well, you know what I mean, I think, right? So the idea would be that basically this lake is always in flux all the time. Now, obviously that isn't the case, and that isn't entirely true. There are aspects to the world that are potentially stable. But these elements of the world that are potentially stable, again, are built by what I would call then ego structures. So they're essentially extensions, the kind of prosthetic God, right? Or the kind of prostases of the ego, right? The attempts to control that which is outside, right? Like, if we build, let's return to the financial topic, and let's say you've built the unpredictability of your income stream has led you to build a stable income stream based on investments that you made in real estate. So you bought a bunch of apartments, and now your tenants are paying rent. Okay, well, you think that's stable. You think you can build it. You can think, now I can retire. I'm earning enough money, and I'm earning them on a stable basis. Well, you'd be surprised if your tenants are suddenly starting to go into sort of anarchy mode burn down your house and come for your home too, because you're an evil capitalist kind of thing, right? Like that's a possibility, right? It's a possibility that the ego successfully suppresses for a very long time, and that we have built structures to suppress in society, but it's not an impossible outcome. And I think, by the way, that precisely these extensions or prostheses within nature, right? That's what gardening is about, right? That's what do you know the stuff you drizzle on if you have a, oh my god, I've never talked about this in English, but do you know the kind of, when you have a place where you have a place where you grow flowers, right, in your garden, and so you have all these rare flowers, and you don't want the kind of stuff that you don't want growing in your garden to grow there, you know, the kind of bad stuff, right? The kind of chaos that creeps into your garden always after a week. Like, you go and you rip it out of the ground, and then after a week it's just like it comes back, and you can't, it reemerges from the depths, you know, and then you come and you have this life hack, and you just take the shell of the trees, and you make it really small, and you can drizzle it on top of the soil, and so that would be an attempt to create an artificial system, right? And it may silence the kind of chaos from emerging for a longer time, but it won't do it indefinitely. Let me tell you, I've tried, as you may be able to tell, it's not going to last indefinitely, right? And so what we can learn from this metaphor is essentially that change or constant work is necessary in order to maintain a system that has artificially been created. And one simple, way of thinking about this is in terms of entropy. Like, things fall apart. That's what it is. That's life. Things fall apart. And the argument I'm making is pretty much as simple as that, but it's a little more complex, I'd say, in the psychological sphere than it is in the sphere of physics. Because in the psychological sphere, you have the ego as a force of resistance against this change. Like, the ego doesn't want change because change is painful. And that's, you see this in older people, right? They don't want to change anymore, and they become tyrannical. And that's something. If you become tyrannical and then something hits you in the face or pulls, then that crowd comes creeping up from the depths of the underworld beneath your garden, and you ignore it, and then suddenly I don't know where you live, you suddenly live in hell, right? It's like if you ignore the letters that come to your mailbox that are bills, right? Most of the time, for too long, you'll live in hell at some point. Because you're not going to be able to tame the chaos that's risen from the underground. But the idea here isn't to, again, tyrannically go in and attempt to change everything again and build structures again and again and again. The idea is that the environment kind of already inherently shows you, right? This is a path to unfold towards. And so the question becomes, what is change, right? I mean, and again, like, I'm not saying or arguing that the environment has the key to the truth, or nature or whatever, or the world. Not at all. But what I'm calling for is, instead of saying I'm keeping my own structures, I'm making them stronger, I'm building my walls higher, attempt to look at that which is beyond the wall, right? Maybe the kraut that grows from the underground, maybe there is something to learn from that. Maybe you have to mold it in another way. Maybe there's a way to work with it, right? Maybe the letters that you're receiving, maybe there's a reason why you're getting them. Maybe they're pointing towards something. Maybe you need a new system. Maybe the kind of rigid system of attempting to tame everything that's not roses in your garden, maybe that's wrong. Maybe you should consider doing something else, right? And so I think those are approaches. And again, in Jung, we see a lot of that, especially when we get into the argument of the collective unconscious. We're trying to bring the collective unconscious into this and the archetypes. We see a lot of that inherent in his theories, right? Like, how to attempt to change your ego, not based on the ego, but based on a third. And obviously, like, a lot of what you see in common approaches to this issue, and I think I see this with Jordan Peterson as well, and I think it's quite problematic, is that the response to the emergence of chaos is more order. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to attempt to embrace chaos and move into it to some extent voluntarily, and to attempt to find pathways of meaning within that which is emerging from the depths. But I will make another video sort of as a sequel to this on this sort of the dyad between the ego and the world, and this sort of mediating third, the self, I would propose. So stay or look out for that, and again, like, look out for that. The best way to do that is by subscribing to the channel, obviously, and I very much appreciate that. And yeah, thanks for watching. I think we're at the end of this video. Thanks for watching. I very much appreciate it.